The gospel passage you just heard, this incredibly rich narrative, the writer of Mark's gospel introduces us to two characters of completely opposite means. There's Jairus, a wealthy leader of the synagogue whose daughter is very, very sick. And there's an anonymous woman who has no name, that we're told, who has suffered with a sickness that has left her ceremonially unclean and thus on the very outside edges of society for 12 full years. It's no coincidence that we hear all of Jairus' accolades along with nothing, not even the name of the woman who strained through the crowd to anonymously touch Jesus' robes in hopes of healing. They couldn't be more different from one another. One prominent, connected, well-resourced, the other anonymous, alone, at the end of any options she may have been able to find. Two ends of the spectrum. And here in Mark's gospel, they meet in the middle on a plane where all of those details fall away, and the raw humanity of each one of them makes them exactly the same. And Jesus, seeing each of them as level in their desperate straits, human, meets their needs. This gospel is about two incidences of healing in the ancient world, and it's a story about the plight of being human. As such, our gospel lesson today is for anyone who has ever felt broken, whose life has seemed unmendable after a tremendous rending, anyone who has felt the world that they know and carefully create and tend to be falling down around their ears, anyone who's desperate. In other words, today's gospel lesson is for all of us. Because when it comes to being human, we are all the same. Longing for connection, waiting for healing, wandering until we find meaning. When we face those moments in life that visit all of us, no matter who we are, it might be that then we can finally be honest enough to receive the kind of restoration, of healing that God longs to offer us, the kind of restoration that begins when we are fully seen for exactly who we are, beloved children of God, fully human and deeply precious to the one who created us. Today is week 5 in a series that we've undertaken in worship over these weeks, examining Sabbath. Sabbath means rest. It's God's commandment to take a period of time set aside, a break from the constant urgency of life on this spinning planet, time to remember who we are and whose we are, and to reset ourselves for the work of being human in this world. It's not easy to take Sabbath on a regular basis, which is probably why God decided that this command should make our list of the top 10 commandments. There's something fundamental and necessary about Sabbath. Today we think about Sabbath as restoration, of taking all the fragmented pieces of our humanity and allowing them to settle into place, back together again. Return to wholeness. Every single one of us needs this experience of restoration, of course, because the world in which we live surrounds us with broken pieces that tear at the fabric of our lives and of our relationships, so that if we're not careful, we become almost unrecognizable in our fragmentation. The Sabbath gift of restoration reminds us who we were created to be, not victims of the pain that we carry, but precious, whole children of God. Notice that in both of these situations in Mark's story, Jesus looks beyond the trappings of each one's humanity and sees each person for who they are. To Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, Jesus goes straight to his home, dismisses all the powerful people keeping watch over his daughter's sickbed, goes to her and calls her by a familiar name and heals her. And when Jesus knows that the hem of his robe has been touched by someone longing for restoration, he looks out at the crowd and he says, "Who touched me?" His way of calling forward the humanity of this woman who society has discarded, looking her in the eyes and seeing her in all her beautiful and broken humanity. What a relief to be restored. What a relief to be seen as who we are in a world that assigns so many trappings to our identities that we forget who we were created to be. Restoration, that Sabbath practice, happens when we are seen for who we really are. And restoration is the foundation on which our healing can begin. As many of you know, I took a trip this week to McAllen, Texas, right on the border of the United States and Mexico. Reverend Jim Keat, our Associate Minister of Digital Strategy and Online Engagement, traveled with me and a group of women clergy leaders from around the country to speak publicly about the inhumane immigration policies of our American government, especially the particularly heinous practice of separating families who come to the U.S. border seeking the safety of asylum, putting children and their parents in cages, and using family reunification as a tool to get people to surrender their claims for asylum. The situation on the border is much like you have seen on the news, maybe even worse. The region is intensely militarized, with soldiers and border patrol officials and police readily evident everywhere you go. The borders on the edge of the United States and Mexico are locked down so tight. It is amazing the determination that it must take to bring yourself, much less your children, across that militarized zone to the other side of the wall. McAllen, Texas's small historic downtown is a pretty sad sight. There are lots of boarded up storefronts having given way to the Walmarts and the TJ Maxxes in the surrounding suburbs, all of which are supported, of course, by the vast industry of detention and border patrol. Right on the edge of downtown McAllen, about a block from the Greyhound bus station, there's a stuccoed storefront and a white sign mounted on the roof, and it reads, "Catholic Charities, Humanitarian Respite Center." This was curious to me, as having worked for many years in large downtown gospel missions and homeless shelters, I have never seen a place that's called a Humanitarian Respite Center. I hadn't heard of it, of course, because it didn't exist before now. Sister Norma Pimentel, her close-cropped salt and pepper hair, crisp blue Oxford shirt, and navy blue nun's jumper, explained that she had noticed not too long ago there was an increasing stream of immigrants, families mostly, who, having crossed the border near McAllen, were detained as they made their cases for asylum. Most of the folks who try to do this are detained, separated from each other, and then deported. There are very few, the elite in this case, who were attached to ankle bracelets and then allowed to pursue their claims for asylum. They're released from detention centers and told to find their way to family or friends in the United States. These families are ceremoniously deposited at the local bus stop station, at the Greyhound station, and they're told that they're now on their own to make their way to family in far-flung places across the country. This is a daunting task with spare resources of money and facility in the English language. Imagine how it feels when you've been just newly reunited with your traumatized 2-year-old who has been separated from you for several weeks. You haven't had a shower or a clean change of clothes in that time frame. You can't understand anything that's happening to you. Finding yourself at the McAllen Greyhound station then might not be the most comforting place. As I looked at the group inside the shelter, I commented to Sister Norma about how young some of the children were there. She told me that on Tuesday, the day before we were there, they had a 14-day-old newborn come in with his mother. 14 days old, the baby was born on her trip to the border. The mother continued traveling after giving birth, then spent time in detention separated from her newborn baby. I asked how they were doing, and Sister Norma said the baby was healthy, but the mom was very exhausted. I guess so. Sister Norma kept encountering desperate people like this family, so she began looking for a place of respite, a humanitarian respite center, you might say. She started it in a hastily erected tent off the side of a Catholic church, and then began looking for something permanent or at least air-conditioned. When she did, she was approached by a local sheriff who came to Sister Norma and said, "Last night, my mother and my wife sat me down and said, 'You know, Sister Norma, go see her and help her with whatever she needs.'" What she needed, of course, was a facility, and it turned out that the sheriff's department had a 2-room storefront that was not currently being used. That was a little over a year ago, and now Sister Norma knows that that storefront is just not adequate for the 150 to 400 people who come through every day. So she's trying desperately to convince the Archdiocese of Texas to give her $5 million to build a center that will serve everyone. A humanitarian respite center from the actions of the United States government. So that Wednesday afternoon, we gathered outside the storefront, witnessing parents perched on blue molded plastic chairs, looking exhausted, while their toddlers ran around the room on plastic car toys, embracing the world as if it held all the same possibilities for them as it does for us. I wonder how long it will take for them to find out the truth. The parents watching those children seem exhausted, torn between wanting their kids to embrace opportunity and telling them the reality of what it means to be born with brown skin on the American continent in this moment. As we entered a tour led by volunteers, we saw the station where clients get to call family in the U.S. for the first time. There are often tears there. In the little hallway separating the 2 rooms, there's a station where children receive clothes and parents are given little bags of formula to take with them wherever they go next. And in the other room, that's where they receive what is often the first hot meal they've had in months, a bowl of soup. Volunteers work to get families on the next bus to their eventual destination, but very often a family will have to curl up in the corner and sleep on mats for a few hours until it's time to go. When they leave the Humanitarian Respite Center, they're given pieces of paper printed with large letters that read, "We are going to Baltimore, Cleveland, wherever. We do not speak English. Please help us find our bus." As Sister Norma walks us through it all, she keeps repeating the rule that she has for anyone who comes to help her at the shelter. The first thing that anyone hears when they walk in is a question. ¿Cómo estás? How are you? I sit people down, she said. I look them in the eye and I ask them how they are. It is right in that moment that they begin the process of feeling like human beings again. In that cramped little space in historic downtown McAllen, Texas, people are desperate to begin the process of restoration. Rest, Sabbath. Friends, the tangle of immigration in this country and the plight of refugees around the world, these are not questions with easy answers or simple solutions. We will, however, be destroyed by our hubris if we forget what Jesus knew about Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood and about every other human being in that teeming crowd reaching toward him for restoration. We are, all of us, precious children of God. We feel loss. Our hearts get broken. We're vulnerable to pain, just like each other. The practice of Sabbath restores us to our proper place. It reminds us that we are not God, but rather God's precious creations, and gives us the impetus and the courage to remember who we were created to be. You and I, we need to practice Sabbath restoration, because when we begin to remember who we are, then we can look down the pew or across the table or across a border and see just another child of God who is longing for restoration. Amen.